Today I'm not at the Tank Museum at Bovington, but I was invited there in 2017 to 2019, and I finally wanted to put some photos and footage to good use. So let us look at the M3 medium tank, also known as the Grant and Lee by the British, depending on the variant. At first you might notice it looks like a cross between an M4 Sherman and the French Char B1 bis. The chassis is very similar to the Sherman, but you have all these rivets like on the Char B1, and the tiny turret on top of that chassis and the large gun mounted in the right front of the chassis. The similarity to the B1 bis is not without irony if you consider the fact that the design of the new M3 medium tank began in July 1940 in the wake of the French defeat. As such, the M3 is a bit of a modernized antique. It combines modern features like reliability, mobility, and mass production compatibility. Yet at the same time, antique features like rivets, multi-turret, large size and large crew. The reasons for this were that it was rushed into production, since the fall of France came as quite as a shock. The collapse of France in 1940 had caused an enormous shock throughout the world. In the United States of America, most Americans did not want to believe that the Germans had won and the French were defeated. As such, the US Army wanted a modern medium tank sooner rather than later. The main requirements were a strong frontal arm of at least 2 inches, so about 5 cm, and a 75mm gun that could fire a high explosive round. On 13th June 1940, the characteristics of a tank incorporating the updated requirements were outlined in OCM 15889. The new vehicle was standardized on 11th July 1940 as the medium tank M3. Now, most tanks that were rushed into production like the Panther usually had a multitude of teething problems. Similarly, this was not only a problem the Panther faced, the British had quite many problems with their own tanks as well. The British tanks of the period were notoriously unreliable and suffered unacceptably high breakdown rates. Yet the M3 did not face these problems. According to Zaloga, it was far more reliable than contemporary British designs. Well, the reason for this was the industrial capacity and experience of the United States. The M3 used improved versions of previous US designs. As a result, by the time the M3 medium tank entered production, vigorous testing had wrung most of the bugs out of the automotive components. At the same time, in other areas, there was a certain lack of experience. Most notably when it came to engine design and welding. As you can clearly see, there are a lot of rivets on the tank. You don't want rivets, since if they get hit, their counterpart inside the tank might turn into shrapnel that hits your crew. Now, not all variants of the M3 medium tank had rivets, but quite a lot did. So what is the reason for this? Although industry widely used welding at the time, welding of armor plate presented a significant challenge. Very hard armor steel with a high carbon content posed a real problem because the welds did not withstand shock very well and would crack when hit by an enemy projectile. At the same time, you see quite a lot of round and complex shapes here. These are cast parts. Generally, cast steel provides less armor protection than welded armor plates, yet there are no welds that can be a weak point, and additionally, the rounded shape can provide protection as well. For more information, check out my Tank 101 armor protection video on this. Casting has the other benefit that it reduces production time. The M3 medium tank was the first mass-produced American tank to use a cast turret, and many other components were cast as well. It took far less time to cast a complex structure than to fabricate it out of multiple plates of steel, making casting attractive under the time pressures imposed by the war. On the other hand, American industry had limited casting capacity. One major challenge for mass production was the lack of proper engines and or sufficient supply of them. This was also a major issue with the M4 Sherman tank. The reasons for this were no obvious commercial sources existed, since tank engines had to be significantly more powerful than truck engines and at the same time much smaller than ship and locomotive engines. As a result, the auto plants came up with some ingenious solutions. Now you might wonder, the chassis almost looks like a Sherman, and the Sherman has this nice turret with the 75mm or in some cases even a 105mm gun. So why does the M3 medium tank does not have a proper turret? I mean, the German and British had all plenty of properly mounted turrets at the time, so why this weird construction on the right front? Ordnance had no experience building turrets capable of housing a 75mm gun. They were not certain how large the turret ring would need to be to withstand the recoil forces and had not developed a recoil system compact enough to fit inside a tank turret. In addition, they were leaning toward the use of a cast steel turret to speed up tank production. But industry had yet to prove the ability to manufacture such a large armor casting. Furthermore, Hunnicutt notes that many design problems of a sponson mount for such a gun had been already fixed in the T5E2, which looks like an M7 Priest or M3 Grand without the center turret. It was suggested by the armored forces to only produce the M3 in limited numbers, and once a solution for the turret with the 75mm gun was found, it should be changed. There was only one problem. However, the urgent need for large quantities of new tanks, particularly by the British in the Middle East, would not permit the interruption of the production plans already in progress. Which brings us to the British part of the M3 Medium Grant and Lee story. The British wanted the US industry to produce their own tanks like the A-12 Matilda and the A-15 Crusader. Yet, as this was not going to happen, the Americans presented them with the M3 Medium. Regarding the M3 Medium, the British were particularly unhappy with the fighting arrangements in general, and specifically they objected to the location of the radio set. In fact, there was little about the tank they did like. In the end, it was only American agreement that the British might have some concessions, like the design of the turret and some modest changes to the fighting compartment, that tipped the balance. That, and the fact there was really no alternative. So what were the main differences? As you can see here, on the left is the American M3 and on the right the British. The British turret was slightly lower yet wider. Additionally, it did not fit a machine gun couple on top. Furthermore, only 6-man crew was required instead of the 7-man crew of the US design. Since the British version, the radio was in the turret and the loader of the 37mm gun served also as a radio man. Note that Hunnicutt mentions that later the crew was changed to 6-men, although he does not specify if this refers to the British version or not. These different designs are also the reason for the different names given to the variants. The British designation for their version of the M3 was the General Grant 1. The standard US model was referred to as the General Lee 1. It was obvious which one they considered the winner. Yet there are two caveats to this. First, the British also received 1,347 M3 tanks in the Lee configuration. And more importantly, British units seldom distinguish the Grant and Lee, generally labeling both types as Grants, regardless of the turrets. Let us take a short look at the main armament, or better armaments. In the turret was the 37mm gun. It was meant to be used against tanks. Although, when the tank was used in jungles of Burma, the 37mm with canister rounds was used against trees and foliage to eliminate camouflage of Japanese troops. Initially, the 75 was considered as support artillery and not as a primary anti-tank weapon, so there was little or no concern about muzzle velocity or armor-piercing performance. Initially, there were some solid steel rounds issued, but those tended to break when they hit face-hardened armor plates. There were also some issues with the sights as well. Ironically, the first proper armor-piercing ammunition was captured by German rounds mated with American cartridges. According to Fletcher and Zaloga, the first proper armor-piercing ammunition were improvised from captured German ammunition of the short-barreled 75mm gun from the Panzer IV. Later, the 75mm gun was replaced with a longer-barreled one, which also provided a higher muzzle velocity, thus improving the armor-piercing capabilities. So let us look at strengths and weaknesses. One major problem the British faced in the desert against Rommel was the combination of German combined arms, particularly anti-tank guns, anti-aircraft guns in the anti-tank role, and tanks together. In contrast to the British combination of cruiser and infantry tanks. The British cruiser tanks were armed first with the 2-pounder and later the 6-pounder guns. Both of these had excellent anti-armor performance, but did not offer a high explosive punch. This was particularly a problem when engaging anti-tank guns, since they were very small and required a direct hit or a sufficiently large blast. The Grant offered an antidote to the anti-tank gun threat, since it could fire an effective high explosive projectile that had a much greater chance of disabling an anti-tank gun even without a direct hit. The Grant 75mm gun was also effective in the anti-tank role, and was supplemented by the 37mm gun in the turret, which offered performance similar to the British 2-pounder tank gun. Another benefit, as already mentioned, was the reliability. Furthermore, the M3 medium tank could take a serious beating. One Grant had been hit no fewer than 31 times, with the only damage being caused by two 50mm hits on the front visor and the rear hit by a 37mm gun. Although like any other tank at the time, it was no match for the Flak 88 with anti-tank rounds. There were also some drawbacks. The obvious one was that the 75mm gun had a limited traverse, but its position also prevented the tank from being used in a proper hull down position. Since, well, if your gun is mounted in the hull, you can't use it when you cover your hull. The dual configuration had another drawback as well. The dual 37mm and 75mm armament was a distraction to the commander because it was difficult to concentrate on more than one target at a time. The large size, especially in height, was a major issue as well, especially in the rather flat desert. At times the height was a benefit for better spotting, but generally the larger you are, the more flak you're gonna catch. Now let's briefly touch the variants. The M3A1 had a single casting for the hull superstructure instead of a riveted design. The M3A2 used a welded hull, whereas the M3A3 used a welded hull and a diesel engine. Then there was the M3A4, which used a multi-bank engine combining 5 bus engines together. Then there was the M3A5, which used rivets and a diesel engine. Let us take a short look at production. Serious production started in June 1941 and ended in December 1942. According to Zaloga, a total of 6,258 M3 medium were built. 1,660 of these used the British turret, which is a bit less than 27%. During the course of production, a variety of incremental improvements were undertaken across the entire M3 family. British reports indicated that the side doors were susceptible to spall damage, so an escape hatch was added to the belly and the hull doors were welded shut. In the final production runs, the hull doors were completely absent. Well, I hope you liked this episode. Thank you to Andrew for reviewing the script. Big thank you to the Tank Museum at Bovington for inviting me in 2017, 2018 and 2019. At the first trip I also recorded my top 5 tanks videos there, so you might want to check that one out. As always, sources are listed in the description. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you for watching and see you next time.